today I'm here with Casey, who is the CEO and founder of Osmosis AI, and we're going to dive in and talk about Casey, talk about the company, and just talk about RL. Thanks for joining us, Casey.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Just to kick it off, do you want to just briefly tell us what Osmosis does?
Yeah. So the quick overview on Osmosis is we're building an end-to-end platform for reinforcement learning. Or more specifically, we help companies fine-tune open source language models that can outperform foundation models at a fraction of the scale.
And before we dive in even more, I do want to learn a little bit about you, Casey. So we've chatted a couple times before, but for everyone else, just let's start with where are you from and where'd you grow up?
Yeah, I grew up pretty close to New York, actually. I grew up in the Boston suburbs. So I grew up in this town called Wellesley, where there's Wellesley College, Babson College, so a small college town. Grew up there, spent my whole life there, stayed local for college, so went to Northeastern in Boston as well, graduated there, and then moved out to SF afterwards.
Yeah. I'd love to just maybe hear, what were you doing in high school? Like, what was life like in the area?
Yeah.
So did you have any interesting hobbies growing up?
I think high school was a combination. There were three things that dominated my time. One was obviously school to some extent. And other than that, I had two main uses of time. I think one, I was playing piano competitions. I used to be involved in classical piano. So did that, starting from elementary school on, so like a total of 8-9 years before before I left for college.
Yeah.
And then the third bucket of time that I spent was with gaming, actually. It was with specifically esports or competitive video gaming. Back in high school, I used to compete in League of Legends tournaments, and then gradually that became me coaching professional League of Legends teams out in Europe and North America.
Were you ever on a platform for coaching, or was that your project?
I was on a few platforms for coaching at the time. At the time, Gamer Sensei was a pretty big one. There was another platform called Metafy that I knew a lot of friends that were on. I'm friends with one of the early PMs there, actually. He's at scale now.
Okay.
Yeah, the gaming to AI pipeline is interestingly strong. But I did that. That was and that was the core, I guess, like the genesis behind me starting my first company in gaming as well.
What was the first company?
Yeah, it was this company called Challengers Uprising, and we were basically a tournament operations platform.
Okay.
So we would work with game developers like Riot Games and Activision Blizzard to run third-party tournaments for them, mainly focused on like semi-pro, second tier, and collegiate competitions. Okay. So they would outsource to us. We would get in the sponsors, we would get the teams, and we would handle all the operations of running the tournaments and the live streams and things like that.
So it was actually running the tournaments themselves, less the software, because I've used a lot of products where it's just bracketing software for managing.
Yeah, I'm sure we've used some of the same ones, but at the start at least, it was just the services element. And then by the end of the company, before we got acquired, we were thinking about branching more into the software product side for that as well.
Got it. I don't play it anymore, but I was pretty good at Smash.
Yeah.
And I would say top percentile Smash player online.
What was your main?
I played Ike, actually, which is very, very low tier.
Yeah, I was going to say, not a common main.
But I don't know. I just got sunk into it. Ike was good early on, and now I'm just too engrossed. But yeah, I would definitely say I'm probably the best player here at Datadog.
Do you guys have Datadog tournaments?
I've heard they did that before, but
it might be time to bring it back, if not just to showcase your skill.
I agree. I think the gaming to AI pipeline is strong.
That's a challenge for all Datadog, watchers.
So if you're watching and you're good at Smash, let me know. But there's definitely a cohort here who are trying to get really good, and I've been coaching them, but it's going to take a while for them to get tournament level. But that's exciting. Cool. So thanks for kind of sharing the early journey. How did you meet Andy?
I met him in middle school. So Andy grew up in China in a city close to Shanghai called Hangzhou. And so he grew up there, moved to the U.S. in middle school, and that's where I met him.
Yeah.
I think in 6th or 7th grade. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. And I know you spent some time in New York. You worked at one of the VC firms here in New York, Audacious. Or actually, no, they were in SF. Sorry.
Yeah, in SF, but I've spent plenty of time in New York here throughout my life. Yeah.
So did you spend time in New York right after college, or what was in New York?
It was, I just came out here pretty often to meet with folks, like either in the ecosystem or meeting with friends. The two often ended up being intertwined, but yeah.
And that's kind of how we first met, which was a wild 2021, I think, or something around then.
I think 22. Yeah, it was a happy hour or something
Yeah, the New York City tech scene is a little small. You can kind of meet everyone.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so that was New York, and then you moved to SF for Audacious, is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so you did VC, and then you jumped to the founder life. How was that?
It was interesting. I went from founder to VC to founder again, so I kind of boomeranged.
Yeah.
I spent around 1.5 years total with Audacious, which ended up being shorter than they thought and I thought. I think, part of the benefits of venture capital is that you get to spend time with amazing founders. And I think what I began to realize pretty quickly was, as I met more and more great founders, I just started to feel like, hey, why am I not doing this as well? And so there was like the sense of FOMO that set in pretty quickly.
You spent some time in New York. You spent some time in SF. I imagine the cities are a little different. What's it been like spending much more time in SF?
SF can be boiled down to one word, which is tech. And I think New York is kind of the opposite. New York is a melting pot when it comes to culture, ethnicities, and I think it's the same way when it comes to people with with their various vocational focuses too. New York is kind of a city where you can find everything, and SF is the opposite, where SF is all in, fully specialized on tech. And so I think there's pros and cons that come with both, right? And you kind of alluded to this as well. I think if you go to I recommend this for everyone whenever I talk with folks that are undergrads or graduating soon, when they always think about what cities to move into. If they want to get involved with startups or tech, I recommend all of them move out to New York, move out to SF, and spend time there. Yeah. That was a Freudian slip. Simply because the size of the ecosystem, the community is so large that it almost manufactures luck or serendipity for you, just given the way, various different ways in which you can meet people. Yeah. But I think there's also trade-offs that come with that too, right? If all the people that you know are in tech, your worldview kind of becomes shaped by those around you, and it ends up reflecting only one perspective. Yeah. So there's pros and cons. It's like a double-edged sword.
Yeah, I would say I generally agree with that. I was in SF last month for a conference, and so we're in the New York Times building right now. Yep. And very regularly there are protests outside of the New York Times building, and usually it's a very, very heavy topic. It's about Gaza, Palestine, and then in SF, we were at a conference and there were multiple doomer protests.
Oh yeah, and I've seen some of them too.
And hunger strikes, and it's like to me that's like, oh, it's pretty different. Like the things people care about here versus SF are very different, and pros and cons to each. Cool. I want to talk a little bit about how Osmosis is how things are going with Osmosis. So I kind of just want to start with, first of all, congrats on the launch, the raise. I did see that your list of angels is pretty stacked. And I got to ask, how does that work? How did you find all these angels?
Yeah, I think, we went through Y Combinator at the beginning of this year, and I think we're very fortunate in the sense that a lot of them came through to us from that community. Yeah. We met a bunch of them when we were going through Alumni Demo Day and Demo Day. And then afterwards, we got referrals to a lot of other YC founders, and so there was this cascading effect from there. And then our investors were, super helpful with that as well. So one of our co-leads for our seed round was CRV. They introduced us to Guillermo at Vercel. And then for Paul Graham, we had an office hour with him during the batch, and so at the end of it, I just kind of popped the question hey, do you want to angel invest? He was like, yeah, sure.
Cool. Osmosis is very much in the RL space. For folks who aren't as familiar with RL, how do you generally summarize RL in a sentence or two?
Reinforcement learning is the process of teaching your model or helping your model learn. What do I mean by that specifically? Well, if you think about AI agents are effectively the scaffolding on top of models. Yeah. And there's 3 ways that you can improve the performance of a model. You can improve the user prompt you're giving it. The reality is that that's kind of out of balance for us and for you, right? Because you can't control what the end user says. So there's 2 main viable ways to improve the performance of a model. You improve the way that you're handling its context window. So this is context engineering, prompts, prompt engineering, RAG, all that kind of stuff. Or you improve the underlying model itself. And the differences between the two, I kind of describe them as non-invasive surgery and invasive surgery, right? Because non-invasive surgery, you're not adjusting the prompt. You're not adjusting the model, The model stays the same. Versus for, the other aspect, you're directly iterating and, training the model. That's what reinforcement learning really is. Okay. And so if you're thinking about it in the context of different agentic use cases or why you would use reinforcement learning, use reinforcement learning when context engineering doesn't get the job done. And what we found is that for agents that are deployed across use cases like code generation, vertical tool calling, and browser agent automation, the moment you start to deploy them at scale is the moment in which you start to look at foundation models and ask, can I do this more accurately, faster, and cheaper?
Yeah. When we talk to customers, there tends to be some customers almost have a matrix in their mind. It's how often they do a task, and it's simplicity versus complexity. Is there a sweet spot when to consider RL, simplicity, high turnaround, the shape of variation? Is there a sweet spot for RL?
I think the sweet spot for RL, I think it goes back to one of those 3 factors. Better, faster, cheaper is the value prop that we always promise the folks that we work with. I think when you start to consider RL, or more specifically reinforcement fine-tuning, is when one of those three factors becomes untenable. Maybe your accuracy with context engineering optimization is peaking at 80%, but in order to upsell your product more, or in order to reach new capabilities, you need it to be at 90%, then you should consider fine-tuning. Or, you're deploying your agent and it works, but it works really slowly. Maybe it takes, 10, 15 minutes to solve a task, and you need to get that time down to a minute instead. Well, then you can consider RL for that as well. And then cost is kind of this big, elephant in the room, I think, for a lot of startups, especially where they're scaling really quickly, their products are working, but they're using foundation models for everything. And under the hood, the gross margins are negative, and they start to look at that and say, at what point can I make this sustainable?
You can kind of RL many, many things, and we've kind of followed your journey. We saw the sort of code merge use case, and then we saw the sort of structured outputs use case. Is it really like engineering tends to be the primary area of use case, or where do you see RL sort of? I'm curious if it's like highly varied, or is there targeted use case buckets?
It really is highly varied. I think any use case or domain in which you can grade an outcome in a way that is directionally accurate with how to actually improve a model's performance with it. The way I think about it is that if you're doing supervised fine-tuning, it's like you're given an answer key, right? And you memorize the inputs, you memorize the questions, you memorize the answers, and that's fine as long as you stay within the answer key. But the moment you do something outside of it, the model doesn't know how to respond. Reinforcement learning, empirically tends to be more generalizable, and that's because rather than giving you this answer key and telling you memorize it, it says, hey, here's a problem, try solve it, and then based on how the model solves it, we can give it a grade, right? And it might not know the exact things it got right or wrong, but if you give it a grade enough times and it responds to enough tasks, it starts to understand the shape of the problem, right? And so the use cases that have lent themselves really well to this have been use cases involving verifiable domains, right? Reinforcement learning from verifiable rewards is this big, acronym around the rise of RL these days. And that has, been exhibited through code generation specifically. Code generation is nice because, you have these compilers, right? And so if your model generates code, you can hit the compiler to see whether or not it's valid. And then that can then be taken in as a signal, then train the model to get better at producing, more accurate and more viable code. The challenge here exists then around use cases that are a little bit longer horizon, right? And in which you don't have such clear verifiability in terms of how to generate rewards. And that's, again, where we come in, where other providers might come in and help. There's ways that you can, build around this too. You can build scaffolding through things like RL environments. You can change the way that you're designing your product to collect additional features that you can use to do training for a model. But, just, painting by broad strokes, almost any domain you can think about out there, as long as you have enough user engagement with it and you collect the right type of data, it can be fine-tuned.
Got it. Okay, so it sounds like the more verifiable the domain, the more likely people are to succeed. So that being said, it does sound like engineering use cases probably are good targets, but I am curious, are there broader domains? Are there like back office tasks? Are you seeing appetite there, or is it just we're a little too far from just like those areas being verifiable?
Absolutely, because I think you run into similar issues when it comes to, you can think about vertical agents, right? So this could be anywhere from, B2B customer support agents to agents that handle inventory management for supply chain to agents that handle workflows within the medical domain. You can abstract beyond that. In every single one of these use cases, the agent is parsing through a user request and then using a domain or company-specific set of tools to solve that task. The challenge here is that once you start moving into the multi-step, longer horizon workflows, the workflows that take longer, that have more tools that you need to use, the reliability of the agent goes down dramatically, right? And so again, it becomes this use case for fine-tuning where as long as you collect enough examples of here's how you solve the task correctly, here are the right tools to use. As long as you collect enough of that data, you can then use it to, reinforcement fine-tune a model to get better.
And what does that engagement look like? Is it more consulting where you're like, okay, hey everyone, let's sit in a room, here's like the work you do, and in reality, this work is 6 steps in sequence, and we're gonna optimize each, or you're like, okay, let's do it step by step, optimize one, and then move on and evolve your agent and evolve the process. What does that engagement look like?
Yeah, we can be very hands-on. So for example, with some of the deployments that we've been working on, we handle everything end to end. That starts with assessing their current state of their data and their architecture, right? And then based on that, maybe we want to change the evals, or we want to cultivate a training data set from their existing data. If they don't have that, we can also help them acquire that data. We can help them build out RL environments to create synthetic data to train the model. From there, we can configure these training runs and these experiments to figure out what is the ideal training recipe, as in what model size, what hyperparameters, how much compute, what type of data to give it. And then once we have that, we can scale up the training recipe, get the final model, and then we can deploy that for folks as well. So it really runs the gamut in terms of what people need, but we can provide the end-to-end services experience for them. But all of this is built on top of our platform. That makes it really easy for us to train models in the first place. And we see that as the main point of leverage, because rather than their team or our team spending 1 or 2 days just to set up the harness for one training experiment, we can do dozens at any given, we can spin up dozens in the same day, right? And so we can iterate much faster.
Got it. One big question I have is around agent adoption and RL adoption.
Yes.
One is, it's one thing to just say, okay, I just have tasks that I'd love to get better at, versus you mentioned multi-step action. So maybe how do companies think about agents now? Are they using frameworks? Like, how are they thinking about, honestly, like the problem set they're trying to deal with?
Yeah, I think, as you think about the maturity curve, RL is definitely on the further side of it, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think the first things that people think about are, what are the transactional one-off tasks that I can use a model for? It might not even be an agent, right? It might just be you making a direct call to GPT-5 or something like that. And then after that, they start to think, okay, it can handle those things well, but maybe I want to do some more prompt engineering. So maybe they build some prompt harness around it, or maybe they move to LangGraph. And then they're like, okay, if I'm on LangGraph now, I can set up these nodes to have different subagents to handle these different subtasks. So that means I can suddenly move from one-off tasks to basic multi-step tasks. Maybe I have MCP servers that I can use, that connect to my productivity tools, maybe my Jira or my Linear or my Slack and things like that. And then once they start to get to that point, they're like, okay, these are basic tasks. This is helpful. Mm-hmm. How do I make this more specific to me? Or how do I make this handle higher leverage tasks? Yeah. And you can scale that up pretty far, I think, with just context engineering and foundation models. But once you start to reach scale, you start to realize that these things are very rough around the edges. And a lot of it comes down to the fact that the models that people are using out of the box from OpenAI, Anthropic, et cetera, are generalist problem solvers. They're not specialized towards one task or another. Yeah. And so at some point, it starts to become this blocker. But what we found is the real prerequisite to reinforcement learning is having good evals, right? Because there's two things you need for reinforcement learning, right? You need training data, and you need a way to quantify or grade that training data, right? Okay. So you can't grade a trajectory on whether or not it's good or bad if you can't evaluate it, right? So every company that wants to do RL needs to have good evals first.
Since we're talking about evals, I'd love to hear maybe the maturity of evals. Like, are evals generally a bunch of data sets that are just input output? Yeah. Like, are they auto graders? Are they LLM as judge? Like, what are people doing nowadays?
I think it's still pretty basic. I think the core of it is just that you have static eval sets. Maybe you run your agent against to figure out how performance changes over time. You just have the raw trajectories that these platforms are able to store. Maybe you have things like LM as a judge to track for different things. Like maybe you want to track for hallucination rate, over time, just to give an example. But the way that we think about evals, or how we think about observability, is that it needs to go a step further, because the whole point of reinforcement learning is like, what are you reinforcement? What behavior are you reinforcing in the model in the first place? Oftentimes, you're reinforcing human behavior. You want to act more like humans do when they solve workflows, and so you put that in the context of evals. Well, how do you track what humans want? How do you track human preference? And so oftentimes evals are coupled with how you design the product itself, because you need a way to track human preference. And how are people doing that today? Well, the main thing that people have is this thumbs up, thumbs down design pattern, right? We don't think it's actually a good signal. One, because it's highly sparse, right? There's like less than 1% of people that probably actually use that, no matter what product that you have. And then two, it ends up being highly polarized, because it's the same as restaurant reviews. People only leave a thumbs up or a thumbs down when it's really good or really bad. More often, very bad. And so you can't use that as a signal. So then how do you track human preference? And then how do you turn that into an eval set? That's kind of the core question here. Because if you can crack that, then building out the RL pipelines on top is almost second nature or trivial, because you've already gone through the question of saying, this is how I grade performance, this is how I evaluate what human preference is. And you just use that to then fine-tune the model.
As we talk to customers, I've noticed some of them gravitate towards like 1 to 3 visions of evals, and I would love to get your gut reaction of which one of these are quote-unquote the right way, or like the model we should be thinking about for like RL. So one is some folks treat evals as like the lower bar. Like, hey, whenever I do a model change or I commit a PR, I'm going to run CI/CD and run offline evals. It will never go below this line. Like all these evals need to clear. Then there's sort of the eval as a score, like something I can saturate and like reach. And then there is actually a group of customers who almost treat evals and product analytics at the same thing. And what I mean by that is they want a conversion funnel. It's like, oh, when I use this model, this prompt, and people convert when I do X.
Yeah.
I am curious, do you feel like that model, any one of those models align with what you just said, or they're all evals? Like, how do you think about that?
I think it's all three, right? And I think the third category is what the more mature engineering organizations are thinking about when it comes to evals. I think static evals is fine. That's a baseline, but oftentimes there's drift between the static evals you have and what is needed for production, right? And so static evals are only as good as their data freshness. If you have a static eval set that's 3 months old, that's probably not representative of what production performance actually looks like. So I think you need those, and that's where you start. But then you need to move into the product analytics part, and that kind of goes hand in hand with what I was talking about in terms of collecting human preference data and all that. Like the funnel metrics is a form of that too, right? Yeah. Humans show their preference based on which tools they prefer or which outputs they prefer. And then that's a signal that you want to be using.
Yeah, that's a good point. That makes a lot of sense. Based on what you're seeing in the field, I am curious, a lot of customers roll their own evals. There are many, many evals providers. What are you seeing as the kind of the breakdown of roll your own versus using a solution? And if you're open to sharing, I'd love to hear like what you see in the market as far as eval providers.
It's interesting. I think just about almost every mature company that we've talked to or work with roll their own evals.
Okay.
And I think a lot of that boils down to the evaluation observability products that exist out there today are great to get started with. I mean, they're very self-serve in that way. But I think the challenge is that because there hasn't been there's no dominant design right now when it comes to agentic systems. And part of that exists because there's still an open question around what should you do for context engineering? What should you do for reinforcement learning? And so I think a lot of these evaluation tools that are being built, lowest common denominator is maybe not the right way to put it because there's a pejorative connotation to it, but it is built for, I think, the everyman developer, so like the average person that gets started, wants to build their own AI agent. And I think once you start to get into the enterprise use cases, people are much more exacting or specific in terms of what they want. And so maybe some of these products are deployed in that sense. Like obviously Langsmith is deployed with many enterprise customers, but my guess is that there's a lot of customization that happens on top. So there's not one dominant platform that is really defining the way that people are doing evals today.
Gotcha. Related question. You mentioned some folks are potentially using LangGraph or some sort of agent framework. Any standouts, or are people just doing LLM calls in their projects?
Yeah, I think the standouts, people, and the most common ones I've heard have been LangGraph, AI SDK from Vercel, and then I think a lot of people are almost using like the Claude Responses SDK as like an agentic framework in a way.
Yeah, and I think they recently rebranded to just the Claude Agent SDK.
Yes.
Folks are just using the Claude Code Agent SDK. Yeah, cool. Thanks for sharing. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about, I'd love to hear a little about GTM and how you think about that.
Yeah.
And then I have a pointed question on pricing. So just letting you know ahead of time. So as far as GTM, I would say in the SaaS era, there was this magic belief that we can do product-led growth and everything's just going to work. There's clearly been somewhat of a reversion to, I'm going to call it like forward deploy movement, a bit of consulting. And I think partly these tools are so horizontal, so much as possible, that it's both a little bit of education and a little bit of like consulting to help people get started. How has go-to-market worked for Osmosis? Yeah,
I think these days we're still working very closely with our early design partners, and so a lot of it has been direct. It's like founder to founder, or founder to like me to an engineering leader at a company. So I think in that sense it's been direct so far. I think how we think about the way that we scale it, there's obviously going to be this direct element, right? If we're going after larger companies, whether that's high-growth startups or existing legacy enterprise companies, where it's a forward deployed approach, it's top down in terms of the sale. But I think, thinking from this perspective as an infrastructure company, I think a lot of this just hinges on developer adoption. And so our platform and our forward deployed work is very direct sales focused. But the goal here is also to make reinforcement learning more accessible in the first place. And so we're going to be open sourcing a lot of work, on the Again, like going back to data and evals, that's typically the prerequisite or the blocker for RL. We're going to be open sourcing work around RL environments. We're going to be open sourcing work around open standards and frameworks to make it easy for people to get started with training their own models in the first place. I think the way that we see is it doesn't make sense to monetize that as much. We just want to make sure as many people can get started as possible. And then from there, we can scale up. And then once more people adopt it at a company, you can start to build up that groundswell.
For the longest time, and as far as we've been selling the product, we've gone consumption-based pricing, which has worked relatively well for us. And we're certainly seeing a sort of a movement back to consumption-based pricing, especially for LLMs, obviously. For agent platforms, we've sort of seen there are products that kind of are very much consumption-based. They're going to charge you for compute, for memory, for tool use. And then there are verticalized solutions that are going to try to charge you for like outcomes-based. So things like Sierra are going to try to, only when you escalate to a human, or they won't charge you, but if they close the ticket, they'll try to tie to the business outcome.
Yeah, like Intercom, Fin.
Exactly, like Fin, like Sierra. How do you think for Osmosis, like how do you think about the pricing?
Yeah, I think our pricing is a little bit more traditional in that sense. Okay. We charge for our forward deployed work as professional services, so that's pretty straightforward. Access to the platform right now is a SaaS fee. Okay. And then everything else on top, whether that's the model hosting and the inference we provide or the model training, is all usage-based. And so that's just based on the amount of compute that we're consuming. I'm
going to try something. I'm going to share a couple takes I have, and I'd love to hear, one, if you think it's a bad take, two, if it's makes sense, and then three is like, oh, actually, I really agree with that. How's that sound?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, first take I have is around MCP and tool use. So there are a bunch of MCP definitions, and a bunch of folks are just like hosting MCP servers. My take is that very soon, 99% of MCP and tool use will actually be hosted by the company that originally hosted the API. So the GitHub MCP server will be the one that GitHub runs. Atlassian will have its own MCP server. And there won't be really this mid-tier of, hey, here's a definition, you can host it yourself.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay. I think it makes sense. I think for the companies that host that, there's almost like a reputational risk or like a quality control aspect to it, where they don't want a third party to host a crappy MCP server and then claim it's officially the most used one. It's a form for monetization as well.
Okay, another one. In 3 years, 50% of LLM calls will be open source models, and let's exclude like non-consumer use cases, not using ChatGPT. Higher than 50%?
I think it'll be higher. Yeah, okay. if you exclude consumer, I think it'll be higher.
Okay. Yeah. Can you tell me more? Why do you think that?
Because we're seeing companies consistently get equal, if not better, performance with inference speeds that are 10 times faster, with costs that are 4 to 5 times lower with open source models.
Do you think? I'm actually kind of curious, because now, do you think that breakdown will be local, like these providers like Together or Fireworks actually hosting them? Like, what do you think that breakdown is going to look like?
I think the large part is going to be hosted through inference providers, either AI clouds like those or through folks like us if we're fine tuning open source models for people. Gotcha. But I think for most companies, there's not an express need for local hosting. Like maybe if you're forward deployed literally in an area without internet access, then maybe you need a locally deployed model. But I think I see local models as something that's more still consumer or like hobbyist versus something that's enterprise enterprise need. Or maybe mobile takes off in a few years, and then
One thing I really like, you presented at Datadog a while ago, and you talked about how if there is an 80 or 90% success rate per step, obviously decreases very quickly for the entire task. Every single task will just be RL'd live and continuously in the future. Do you think that's likely the end state?
It will be the end state for some agents, not every agent. Yeah.
Got it.
Not every agent needs, like live or sub-hour data freshness or like update freshness, but I think there's going to be a subset of agents that really benefit from that.
Okay. One dream/vision RPA, like robot process automation folks had, was sort of the watch and learn. Like, hey, I'm just going to record my screen or just do it and talk out loud as I'm doing it. And that will be enough, like 1 or 2 runs would be enough to be that information for the agent. Does that sound feasible in the near term, or when is that feasible?
Conceptually, it's feasible today, right? That's what RLHS was, to some extent. It's do this thing enough times and show the agent how to do it, and it can respond in a similar way. People are doing the same thing today when it comes to AI labs buying our environments. But when it comes to the 1 or 2 example part, I don't think we're not anywhere close to that right now. If agents can learn from just 1 or 2 examples, then we may have, not from a formal definition of AGI, but from replacing human work definition of AGI, we would have that. But we don't have it because part of the issue, and this is one of the challenges of reinforcement learning, it's very sample inefficient. So you wouldn't only need 1 or 2 examples, you would need 200 or 2,000 examples, maybe, depending on how the complexity of the workflow.
What has been, this is kind of a silly one, but what's been the most trivial use case someone has used RL for?
Oh geez, I don't know. I feel like our structured outputs model is kind of silly or trivial, right? Because all it does is you give it some blob and you give it a format and it structures it into JSON for you. I would say that's pretty silly.
Sounds pretty useful, but now it's baked into a lot of these models now.
Yeah. Or they have these the internal model routers and all that to handle part of that work. Yeah.
You mentioned open source models will be much more heavily used in the future.
Yeah.
A lot of the model providers that are closed, they have fine-tuning APIs.
Yeah.
And I don't really know a lot of people that use them. I'm curious if you just have a take on do you think these closed source models that have fine-tuning APIs, do you think that'll evolve, be useful, or how do you think about that?
I think they will evolve. I think today they are still, I would say still fairly basic offerings. I think simply because there hasn't been as much attention. I'll make a distinction too. OpenAI has a fine-tuning API, and they also have a reinforcement fine-tuning API. So they're two separate things. The fine-tuning API is just supervised fine-tuning. In which case, if you have a supervised fine-tuning use case, it gets the job done. It works well. But when it comes to the reinforcement fine-tuning API, I think there's still a lot of things that need to be ironed out with it. I think more people are going to start to adopt it. But I think the question at the end of the day, and this is why we're in part so bullish on open source models, is that companies should ask the question of data sovereignty as well as data control, in the sense that if you're doing fine-tuning on top of a closed source model, OpenAI has full write-in license. And so if you think about customizing or training these models over time, how do you migrate off, right? There's not really this migration process where you can take your data and leave in the same way that you might if you work with a database company. You can leave, but then they'll keep the fine-tuned model on their own. And so I think that's a question that a lot of these companies should think about in terms of what's the portability, what's the flexibility too, right? Maybe today GPT-5 is the best closed source model, but tomorrow it would be Anthropic, and the day after that it would be XAI. You want to use a platform where you have the flexibility to switch between whatever is the best available model.
Hypothetically, that makes a lot of sense, but I am kind of curious if you're seeing customers just have a grab bag of models. Are folks just spanning 5 to 10 models, and even for cross use cases, or what does it look like?
They are doing that, and I think that again speaks to why open source is so appealing. It's because you can just switch between them super easily. You can use whatever models you want. The Qwen 3 family, I would say, is the most popular family when it comes to doing fine-tuning. A lot of agentic companies are just running a bunch of fine-tuned Qwen 3 models, and we default to that too. We think Qwen 3 is amazing.
There are a couple sort of enterprise tools that are gaining traction, and I'm curious if you're also seeing a bunch of customers use them. So things like AI gateways, things like maybe even just routers themselves, so Open Router, blanking at some of the names, but are you seeing a bunch of companies adopting governance gateways? Is that kind of the de facto standard, or is that still early?
Governance less so, but gateways and model routers, yes. I think the incentive for that is, I think traditionally has been driving down latency and increasing performance, because the idea here is that some models perform better on different types of use cases, and so over time, if you can track the trend there, you can dynamically route GPT-5 for this one, and then Claude 4.5 for the other.
And a last question I have for you is a little bit about the structure of how maybe the organization thinks about AI workflows. So there are a bunch of products that are low-code, no-code agent builders. A lot of folks are doing this. Workato, Glean, Dust is a company that's doing this as well. They very much focus on back office. Hey, we're going to connect a bunch of tools and allow a non-technical person to create these agents, versus I think what we've been talking about is a bit of hey, you kind of need an engineer to help you with the process. I'm kind of curious, based on the customers you meet, is there a split between when to use what, or are companies adopting everything across the board? What have you seen?
I think the majority of functions adopt those types of no-code, low-code tools just because they're for non-technical users, and I think engineers I think tend to roll their own tools, or I think for them the primary AI tools that they're using are just the AI IDEs and the CLI tools of the world. I think what I've been noticing is that at least this is what companies are pushing, is that they're trying to converge folks more, where they're trying to get more non-technical users to start using Cursor and Windsurf and platforms like those. And I think over time, I mean, Michael Trails talked about this, the founder of Cursor before, where they want to make coding more English-like or like natural language-like, right? So the developer gets more high-level commands, maybe is more descriptive versus like imperatively writing, the base code themselves.
Maybe a fun question.
Yeah.
So you've spent some time in SF now. I spent 4 years in SF, and I would say it has some of the best ice cream in around.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite ice cream in SF?
I like Garden Creamery.
Oh, okay. I actually have not been to Garden Creamery.
It's close to Bayreuth,
okay.
down in the south part of Mission. They have a lot of Asian flavors.
Okay.
And they have this neat invention. I think they were the first one to do it that I saw, at least. But they have a cup-shaped waffle cone. So you get a cup and you have the cone on top, so you get the best of both worlds.
That's actually a pretty good idea.
Yeah. Okay. And there's no leakage. Yeah. Which is the main reason why cones are unappealing.
That makes sense. Okay. And what about New York? Do you have a favorite ice cream in New York?
Well, it's not ice cream, but I mean, we were just talking about this before, but Cafe Pana is amazing.
Yeah. I also have not been yet, but I've heard very good things. Okay. Casey, thank you so much for chatting. Is there anything else you want people to know about Osmosis?
If you would like to learn more about Osmosis, if you have your own use cases for fine-tuning, or you want to improve the performance of foundation models by switching over to fine-tune open source models instead, check us out at our website. It's osmosis.ai.
And I'll throw it up on the screen here.
Boom.
Alrighty.
Thank you.